Everybody can find a seat where we can slowly start. Thank you so much for coming to the final session of this day. The first plenary session. I am Patrick, and I am chairing this session as the co-host, together with our of panel 1, anchoring in with classical Athens, which is our panel that emerges from the big Dutch anchoring innovation program started by Ibe Sluiter and Anne Marion, involving now more than 40 scholars over a 10-year period who look at how ancient societies implemented innovations in all domains, so not just technical, but also, for example, religious, architecturally, culturally. And that means that we have involvement of philologists, ancient historians, archaeologists, and ancient philosophers. And the program is slowly coming to an end in 2027. And the main idea that we are looking at is how, in a sense, innovations, in order to be successful, are anchored in what is already received as familiar. And in this panel, we actually involve lots of non-anchor innovation people, the only people associated with the program, to see if that idea works for other people as well. And as our test case, we use anchoring innovation in and with that old chestnut classical Athens. It's a great honor that one of our panelists was bumped up to first class, in a sense, by being chosen in the plenary session. So we'd like to thank the organizers for that very much. And before I introduce her, just if you want more information on anchoring innovation, there is www.anchoringinnovation.nl, and there's also the stand-up drill headed by Marion Meyer, who is sitting over there, who has several volumes of the book series associated with anchoring innovation, book Kolonos on display, so you can have a look at that as well. But we are very happy that the first plenary speaker who was chosen is Professor Marion Meyer, who's an emeritus professor at the University of Vienna in classical archaeology. She has an enormous state of surface and a great track record, which mostly focus on the analysis of the function and the expression of images in the ancient world, with a very special focus on classical Athens and on the Levant. So, some time ago now, you started your career with a book on the Griechische Urkunde reliefs, and later on you moved on to other things, and I would like to mention two real important books on the Levant, Die Personifikation der Stadt Antiochia, from 2006, and from 2017, it's a really wonderful book, which I've heard several archaeologists describe as a Bible when it comes to ancient and classical Athens, which is called Athena von Athen, Kunst und Mythos auf der Akropolis bis in klassische Zeit. So we could think of no one better to sort of lead the way for panel 1, and we are very glad that she will now also give kind of the contribution of archaeology to all of you. So please welcome Marion Meyer, who will talk to us on Athena and her Divine Cult Associations and her innovation in myth.
Thank you. Does this work? Oh, yeah, it does. Então, antes de começar, eu queria agradecer a todos aqueles e aquelas que realizaram esta reunião em um ambiente assim estimulante e com uma organização tão perfeita. Muito obrigada. After thanking the organizers, I would like to thank all of you for being here. It's a great honor for me to be a plenary speaker. And I understand that there are a lot of Anglophone colleagues among us. As a non-native speaker, I have a hard time with the English pronunciation of Greek names. So if you might not recognize, some of the names, please forgive me, and you will see them on the screen. Anyhow, the motivation for founding a cult in particular locations at a given time usually remains unknown. In some cases, however, tales that the practitioners of the cult told about the cult recipients and the reasons for the veneration have been preserved or can be reconstructed. Such tales might be modified in the course of time, according to the worshippers' changing interests. Substantial innovations regarding the cult, such as the association of the cult recipient with other figures, entail changes in the tales about the cult and the venerated deity. These new versions of myth serve as anchors for the innovations. In my book about the cult of Athena on the Acropolis of Athens, published in 2017, I analyzed changes in the two charter myths of Athens, both of which feature a local figure named Erechtheus, intrinsically linked to the Acropolis. One is about the birth, it's about his birth, and his adoption by Athena, short the birth myth. The other is about his defense of Athens against an attack from Eleusis, short the invasion myth. I argued that the new versions of the myth explained new constellations that included other Olympian gods who, of course, were venerated not only on the Acropolis. In order to understand the relationship ascribed to the gods, it is necessary to look beyond one century. Let's take a look at Hephaistos and Athena. The home of the cult of Hephaistos was the island of Lemnos in the northern Aegean, and Athens became the second most important center of his cult. Hephaistos was popular in Athens in the 6th century, as numerous images attest, but the earliest testimony for the existence of a cult is the temple for Hephaistos and Athena on the Kolonos Agoraios above the Agora, the civic center of the city. The building project was thought to have been initiated in the mid-5th century, but recent studies by Marion Meyer and Lynch have shown that it was started earlier. Meyer and Lynch are not the first scholars who suggest an early 5th century date and link the temple project with the introduction of the cult of Hephaistos in Athens only a few years earlier, after the conquest of Lemnos by Miltiades around 500 BCE and the Athenian takeover of the island. However, the recent article gives the discussion of these issues new momentum because it provides a thorough study of the architecture and the pottery found underneath the Hephaestion. Myers and Lynch argue that the temple was under construction when the Persians sacked the city in 480 and destroyed the site. After the end of the Persian Wars, in the late 460s, a marble superstructure with a contracted and modernized plan was erected on the preserved limestone foundations. Most of the architectural sculpture was added decades later, with the bronze cult statues of Hephaistos and Athena installed in 416 or 415 as attested by an inscription. The early dating of the building project is convincing, and the location of the temple on the Kolonos Agoraios, Doesn't work. As well as its construction in the 460s, support the connection of the project with the interests of the Philae family, whose most prominent members were Miltiades, the conqueror of Lemnos, and later the hero of Marathon, and his son Cimon, the leading Athenian politician after the Persian Wars. Eurysacus, the son of the hero Ajax and brother of Philios, the ancestor of the Philides, was venerated on the hill. The installation of workshops for metalworking occurred only after the temple had been built, so the workshops can be excluded as a motivation for its location. But is the fact that the Hephaistion is the earliest tangible evidence for the cult of Hephaistos in Athens a sufficient and persuasive reason for the claim that the temple was built for a newly introduced cult? Those who have made this claim have in common that they have focused on the Hephaistion, just as I concentrated on the Acropolis when I studied the cult of Athena in the century. We have to pay more attention to the relationship of those gods. I take it as a challenge to restudy the cult association of Athena and Hephaistos and to be more explicit about it than I was in my book. The cult of Hephaistos in Athens in archaic times has been suggested. The god was frequently represented together with other Olympian gods and images of myths popular since the early 6th century. Hephaistos returned to Mount Olympus, the birth of Athena, who died in Pompeii. And he was praised as a god of craftsmanship, together with Athena in a poem ascribed to Solon. However, this does not prove the existence of a cult. On the Acropolis, a cult for Hephaistos is attested by a double marble throne made in the second half of the 4th century and found near the Erechtheus. Both thrones served for the god's priest and its neighbor for the priest of Bootes, as the inscriptions below the scenes testify. Bootes was the eponymous of the genus of the Aethiobutadae, the genus who provided the priestesses of Athena and the priests of Erechtheus and Poseidon. The thrones thus join officials for cult recipients linked to Athena in the building that we know as the Erechtheion, a building that was called, I quote, the temple on the Acropolis, in which the Archaion Agalma is, in the building inscription of the late 5th century. The Archaion Agalma, the ancient wooden statue of Athena, was housed in the eastern part, whereas the western part was the sanctuary of Erechtheus, as sources of the 5th century BCE attest, with cult sites for Poseidon, Hephaistos, and Bootes, who were venerated there because of their relationship with Erechtheus. In this paper, I can address only a few of the sources that attest that their cults predate the erection of the building. The cult association of Athena and Erechtheus and their association with Hephaistos and Poseidon were explained by the two charter myths I mentioned in the beginning. I argue that 3 subsequent versions of the birth myth and 2 of the invasion myths can be identified, and that every revision served as an anchor for an innovation in cult. If there had not been new cult associations and constellations, there would not have been any need for modifications of the myths. I claim that Hephaistos' inclusion in the birth myth is evidence for the institution of his cult in Athens. There is no evidence for an absolute chronology of this version, but there are arguments for its relative chronology. The earliest evidence for the birth myth is a passage in Homer, Book 2. And they that held the strong city of Athens, the demos of great Erechtheus, who was sworn of the soil itself, but Zeus' daughter Athena fostered him, and established him at Athens in her own rich sanctuary. Where, year by year, the Athenian youths worship him with sacrifices of bulls and rams. The passage might be an interpolation added at the time when the Athenians pushed themselves into the poem that had not included them. It preserves the original version of the myth and explains the most fundamental cult association on the Acropolis, that of the Olympian goddess Athena and the local figure Erechtheus. Only Gaia, the earth, Erechtheus, and Athena are involved, and the focus is on the dichotomy of nature and culture, of processes that happen naturally, like birth and growth, and of processes that take some know-how, like the raising of a child. His birth of the earth marks Erechtheus as a local and as a primordial figure. Earth-born figures can be wild creatures, even monsters, not Erechtheus, because he enjoys Athena's buffet. The myth presents Athena and Gaia as complementary powers. Gaia is the one who gives birth. Athena is the foster mother who provides the child's buffet. This responsibility is in line with the Athenians' expectations of their main goddess in early times, as they can tentatively be reconstructed. Although Athena was the goddess of the citadel, with a sanctuary on the Acropolis, the Athenians did not visualize her qualities as polyuchos by representing her in a martial outfit before the 6th century. Previously, their interest in the goddess seemed to have focused on her as the goddess of Techne, who had taught them how to utilize the olive tree, the god's gift for the Athenians, and how to weave garments. In early Athens, Athena was the goddess for the daily needs and concerns of the population, the meeting of which took know-how, training, and experience, like the cultivation of olive, handicrafts, and the raising of children. Then Hephaistos comes in, and the balance between Athena and Gaia is upset. The story was known to Euripides and to Athenian base painters of the 5th century, as we will see shortly, but the most elaborate source is late. Apollodorus Bibliothecae, composed in Roman imperial times. In this version, Athena is the lone protagonist. She arouses desire in Hephaistos, who pursues her, but the virgin goddess refuses to couple with him. As Susan Deasy points out, this is the only case in which a female figure rejects the sexual approach of a male figure without having to suffer dire consequences. On the contrary, Athena continues to be the main agent. When Hephaistos ejaculates and spills his semen on Athena's thigh, the goddess wipes it off with some wool and thus fertilizes Gaia, who then gives birth to Erechtheus. It is evident that Hephaistos is an addition to the myth and an intruder. Gaia is, per definition, so to speak, on a different level than a mortal woman who needs a male person in order to become pregnant. Gaia can engender by herself, as forcefully described in Hesiod's Theogony. In the new version of the birth myth, Gaia is reduced to the status of mortal women who need men in order to procreate. This drastic alteration of the myth was made, I claim, in order to position Hephaistos in relation to Athena when his cult in Athens was introduced. His inclusion in the birth myth anchored the god in the cult state of Athens. There are several reasons for dating this second version of the birth myth, and with it the introduction of the cult of Hephaistos, to the time before Poseidon was joined to the cult of Erechtheus, an association that became anchored by a new version of the invasion myth. And it is to this myth that I turn now. The only cult for Poseidon ever attested on the Acropolis from the mid-5th century BC to Roman imperial times is the joint cult of Poseidon with Erechtheus. The earliest evidence is this dedication to Poseidon Erechtheus. In Euripides' play Erechtheus, performed around 420 BCE and preserved only in fragments, Athena herself orders the Athenians to found this joint cult and to erect a sanctuary for it on the Acropolis, and the play gives the reason for it. It relates that Erechtheus, the Athenian king, successfully defended Athens against an attack by Eumolpos, Poseidon's son, who intended to install his divine father as tutelary deity of Athens instead of Athena. Erechtheus kills Eumolpos and, in revenge, gets killed by Poseidon. The foundation of their joint cult reconciles the two antagonists. In the tale transmitted by this tragedy, two traditions have been merged. The original invasion myth that celebrated Erechtheus' defense of Athens against an attack by the Eleusinians without any divine involvement, and a recurrent motif known from various sites of Poseidon's challenging established tutelary divinities of cities, charges that always resulted in the god's defeat, or a tie at best. This motif reiterates the antagonism of forces of nature against centers of civilization. My claim that there was an earlier, original version of the invasion myth is based on the following observations. Thucydides mentions the war of the Eleusinians against the Athenians as the only specific example of inner Attic fighting before the unification of Attica by Theseus. This does not prove the historicity of an Eleusinian war, but it speaks to a tradition of this war without divine intervention. The strife of Poseidon and Athena, first attested by Herodotus and the West Pediment of the Parthenon, belongs to a different, later time stratum. Both Herodotus and Pausanias speak of a strife about the land, not a strife about Athens. It thus presupposes the unification of Attica. The conflict of the god turns out to be a later addition to the original conflict of mortals. The superimposing of the strife of Apollo and Athena onto the war between the Athenians and the Eleusinians cannot have been invented by Euripides because the joint cult of Poseidon and Erechtheus already existed when his play was performed, as the dedicatory inscription proves. Euripides' play is just the earliest literary source for the foundation of the cult. I argue that the combination of the Eleusinian War with the strife of the gods was made in the context of the Kleisthenic reforms in the last decade of the 6th century, when the figure of Erechtheus was given a new profile. My main reason is the observation that after this reform, the myth of Athena's earthborn foster child was apparently told for a figure named Erechtheus. All the preserved images of the birth myths date to the 5th century, and they show the core group of the scene, Gaia, the baby, and Athena, in such a consistent composition that there must have been a common prototype, an image that showed Gaia in right profile, emerging from her element, the earth, and Athena coming from the right, bending over to take the child. Therefore, the name Erechtheus, first attested on this cup of the 430s, can be claimed for the child represented in the whole series and for the model too. The earliest base with this scene was made in the early 5th century and provides a terminus antiquem for the invention of the composition. When Erechtheus was introduced, probably by a poem or a hymn, an image was created that served as a tangible, permanent anchor for this new third version of the birth myth. I concluded that in the context of the Kleisthenic reform, that Erechtheus became one of the 10 eponymous heroes for the newly created Athenian Philae, his persona became focused on his role as king of Athens and as defender of the fatherland. He had played this role in the original version of the invasion myth without divine interference, but it was now boosted by Erechtheus' cult association with Poseidon, who, in the new version, as told by Euripides, was said to have killed Erechtheus by ramming him into the rock of the Acropolis. The idea of this way of killing and the thought of Erechtheus' death might have suggested itself by the traditional cult site for Erechtheus on the Acropolis, where libations were poured for him into the crevices of the rock, a site that credibly could have been created when the god's trident drove the king into the rock. When the Erechtheion was built, the site was marked by an altar in the north porch. In the 5th century, Erechtheus and Erechtheus were treated as different figures. Erechtheus continued to be a cult recipient and Athena's cult associate, and he had a joint cult with Poseidon. It was not forgotten that he was born of the earth, but in a way difficult to understand for those who do not live in a polytheistic society. The narrative of the birth myth was detached from him and told for Erechtheus. The cup that provides the first evidence for this name although shows Erechtheus as one of the 3 Urkönige who witnessed the birth of Athena's newborn foster child named Erechtheus. Erechtheus, unlike Erechtheus, never became a cult recipient. He was instead the archetypal cult practitioner and credited with various introductions in the cultic sphere. On the Parthenon frieze, Erechtheus appears as one of the eponymous heroes in the east, Erechtheus as the inventor of the acrobatus race in the north. And both figures were put into a genealogical relationship. In Euripides' play Ion, performed in the late 410s, Erechtheus is the ancestor of Creusa's father Erechtheus. And in the intended list of the Athenian kings, as it was constructed in the late 5th century, Erechtheus precedes Erechtheus. And it has a certain logic that the figure in the birth myth was thought to be older than the warrior. When Erechtheus defended Athens, he was not the first Athenian king, but the descendant of an older one. As I argue, both charter myths got their final form at the very end of the 6th century. There must have been a version of the birth myth with Hephaistos before Erechtheus was introduced. The god cannot have been added at the time when Erechtheus was split off from Erechtheus, because the god appears not only as the father of Erechtheus, as in images of the birth scene, but also as the father of Erechtheus, with whom he is associated in the cult. He had an altar in the Erechtheion and a priest, as we saw. He was explicitly named as the father of Erechtheus and the ancestor of the Genos of the Aethioputadae, the Genos that provided the priests of Erechtheus and Poseidon. Although these priests had a trident as the insignia of their office, as attested for the late 4th century, they did not trace their Genos to Poseidon, but to Erechtheus and Hephaistos. This clearly marks Poseidon as a newcomer to the cult. Hephaistos, however, accompanied his son, so to speak. He continued to be venerated as the father of Erechtheus in cult, while in images he figured as the father of Erechtheus. The end of the 6th century, as the terminus ante quem for the inclusion of Hephaistos in the verses, is supported by a piece of evidence outside Attica. Pausanias saw an image of Hephaistos pursuing Athena at the throne of Apollon in Amyclae near Sparta. This monument is not preserved and it's dated to the middle or to the end of the 6th century. I suggest that the introduction of the cult of Hephaistos was accompanied by the introduction of a new festival, the Chalkeia. There is inconsistent evidence as to the cult recipients of this festival. The name suggests a connection with the metalworking god Hephaistos, but the 4th century editographer Phanogemos found it necessary to emphasize that it was not a festival, but it was a festival not for Athena, but for Hephaistos. The goddess was definitely involved in the festival, as attested by an inscription of the early 3rd century BCE and by late sources that inform us that at the Chalkeia, the priestesses of Athena with the arephoroi, girls in the service of the goddess, began to weave the peplos for Athena. This ritual also points to Hephaistos and is my argument for connecting the introduction of the festival with the introduction of his cult. The Chalkeia were scheduled for the last day of the month of Pianotion, 9 months before the Panathenaea were celebrated in late Ecbatonion, and the peplos dedicated as the collective votive offerings of the Athenians. This time span between both festivals has already been seen as a reflection of the period of gestation of a baby, 9 months. Gestation, however, is only relevant when there have been insemination. Gaia did not need insemination. The idea of insemination presupposes the involvement of Hephaistos. The festival thus showcases the particular partnership of Athena and Hephaistos and the gods' fathering of the earth-born child. And the peplos, begun at the Chalkeia and dedicated at the Panathenaea, firmly linked the cult of Hephaistos with the Acropolis, where the Panathenaea were celebrated. The peplos dedication is a hotly debated subject among archaeologists beyond the scene of the Parthenon frieze. According to ancient sources, the peplos decorated with an image of the gigantomachy was fabricated for the Great Panathenaea, celebrated every 4 years. The Chalkeia were apparently an annual festival. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the rite of the peplos dedication was performed every year as a permanent reminder of the Athenians' devotion. It probably had a long tradition as an appropriate sign of appreciation for the goddess of Techne and was performed before the great Plenary were introduced in 566, and the gigantomachy chosen as the design for that particular peplos, the peplos for the great Panathenaea. The rite of the peplos dedication was used for anchoring the newcomer Hephaistos. The beginning of the weaving at the Chalkea, 9 months before offering the cloth, discreetly pointed to a product that also took 9 months to mature at that linked Hephaistos with Athena, Erechtheus, the son of Gaia and Hephaistos. Evidence for dating the inauguration of the Chalkea is lacking. There were impressive innovations in the second quarter of the 6th century. The construction of the first peripheral temple of the Acropolis, the reform of the Panathenaea, with the institution of the athletic and hippic competitions, the invention of the gigantomachy of the Olympian gods, and a tremendous boom in pottery production with images. I think that the interests that led to these innovations also account for the inclusion of Hephaistos in the birth myths. The god's frequent appearance on Athenian vases of the first half of the 6th century has already been mentioned, but it does not prove the existence of a cult. The vases as such, however, point to the god of their craftsmanship. In the late 7th century, the Athenians adopted the black figure technique from the Corinthians. And this is a specific technique of drawing with, sketching the details within the silhouette. The Athenians taught the art of the potter and this technique of decoration to perfection. And within half a century, they became the leading producers of fine ware. The success of the Athenians depended largely on a refined firing technique that resulted in the high-quality black glaze typical for Athenian vases. Firing pottery is a delicate and risky business. In the initial phase of producing their fine black pottery in the late 7th and early 6th century, the Athenian potters must have been particularly aware of their dependence on the god of fire. Hephaistos' support was vital for their success. I see the introduction of the cult of Hephaistos as a timely response to the growing pottery industry of the early 6th century. But why not just set up an altar for Hephaistos in the potter's quarter? Why include the god in the charter myth of the city? First, the god of fire was the god of metalworking, and he had to be put in a relationship with Athena, the city goddess, who was also responsible for the art of craft. This relationship not only had to leave the city goddess undiminished, it had to highlight her qualities. The link of the god of metalworking with the goddess who received the peplos and was thus appreciated as the goddess of weaving reflected a closeness of the capacities of those divinities. In the Odyssey, both are said to have taught all manner of craft, and they were praised as the gods of craftsmanship in a poem ascribed to Solon. Second, the innovative elements of the great Panathenaea attest to a keen interest in increased activity and visibility of the male Athenians at the festival. Before 560-60, the festival would have comprised a procession, hymns, prayer, sacrifices, and the dedication of the peplos, the Athenians' collective offering. Athenian women and girls were responsible for the production of the peplos from the preparation of the wool to the act of dedication. Athena had a female priestess, of course. The peplos thus highlighted female performance. Furthermore, there's reason to presume that already in early times, male Athenians were dancing the Pyrrhiki, a dance with arms. This would have been an explicitly male performance, albeit an ephemeral one. After the introduction of hippic and athletic agones at the Great Panathenea, male performance dominated during the festival. This was, of course, not the result of deliberate gender politics. The Athenian festival was modeled after Pan-Hellenic festivals, but the effect was obvious. I wonder whether, at a time when the dedication of the peplos, the product of female handicraft, did not suffice anymore as the highlight of the great festival for the city goddess, Erechtheus' birth of the earth might have been considered too primitive, too simple, an affair too exclusively female, lacking any male participation and contribution. The inclusion of a male figure would, however, infringe on the roles of Athena and Gaia, and if one of them was to be diminished, it could not be Athena's. With the virgin goddess as the protagonist, the male contribution to procreation could not be the natural one. The proper way of engendering offspring was by penetrating a female, not by ejaculation onto a desired partner or onto the ground. What happened in the new version of the births was imperfect procreation. It would be credible only for a god with imperfect physicality, Hephaistos. The new version of the myth marked Hephaistos as a male who wanted to procreate, an intention definitely seen positively, and who eventually fathered Erechtheus. And it highlighted Athena as a Parthenos and as the principal agent. She aroused desire, wiped the god's semen onto the earth, and thereby achieved fertilization. Athena was attacked, but remained unimpaired. Just as in the second version of the invasion myth, she was challenged by Poseidon, but confirmed as the city goddess. In the new version of the birth myth, the encounter of Athena and Hephaistos was brief and not congenial. In cult, Athena and Hephaistos were reconciled, although not joined in cult as Poseidon and Erechtheus were. On the Acropolis, Hephaistos was and remained linked to Erechtheus. In images, Hephaistos might be present at Erechtheus' birth, but he was not an indispensable figure. It is the temple we call the Hephaistion that served for a common cult of Hephaistos and Athena. When it was finished, it became the main Athenian cult site for Hephaistos, and the Kolonos Agoraios became a hub for metalworkers. Eventually, the conspicuous temple eclipsed Hephaistos' altar on the Acropolis. To sum up, I think there are good reasons to claim that a cult for Hephaistos was instituted in Athens in the first half of the 6th century. It would have been introduced with an altar on the Acropolis, erected close to cult sites for Erechtheus, and anchored by the god's inclusion in the charter myths of Erechtheus' birth of the earth, with Athena's enhanced role as the agent responsible for every stage of the narrative. The focus of this paper gave me the opportunity to rethink about my arguments, add new evidence, and elaborate on this anchoring more explicitly than I have done in my book. A new suggestion is a link of the founding of the cult with the institution of Festival of the Chalkea. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Thank you very much, Marion, for such a thoroughly argued paper. Really fantastic. We have some time for questions, and for that we have two people with microphones. So if you want to ask a question, there. maybe sort of raise your hands and someone with the microphone can see you and walk off.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper, and I thought quite very convincing. This is a question of pure ignorance. Or are Hephaistos or indeed Athena ever actually depicted potting or throwing pots? Does that ever come up?
Athena, the goddess Athena, making pots, you mean?
Or Hephaistos?
Well, no, Hephaistos wouldn't make pots, and Hephaistos would work on the, how do you call them, bellows. Yeah, he would work there. This is shown mostly in his zoological context, for example, in the gigantomachy. So he would not produce pots, but what is very often depicted in scenes that show potters at work, that we have, for example, small icons or reliefs, we have demons. It's made very clear that that you needed divine support for having the success of the firing. Athena is not shown dealing with pots, but for example, she is shown forming the clay core for a bronze for the statue, a bronze statue of a horse, for example. Then she's shown scribing onto a small tablet. So she's shown doing practical things, but not in this not in this breathtaking way that Hephaistos is actually the god who is sweating and working on the bellows.
Yeah, over there.
So thank you so much, Marion. I just wonder when and how was the link established then to the Kekropidae? So as far as I know, the cult is very archaic and very ancient. And so Kekrops, the father of Erechtheus, so that's another anchoring of this whole family, and so the Kekropidae then are sort of the double of the Arephoroi, and we have the Erechtheus temple, the ball playing ground there. So maybe you can elaborate on that.
The Kekropidae dancing. This is actually was next with Kekropidae. I think that the Kekropidae as an anonymous triad, as is normal for these maiden triads to be anonymous, but this belongs to a very old, very primordial stage of the myth. But then they don't have names. And then in the 5th century, we suddenly get names of the Kekropes: Atlaros, Pandrosos, and Herse. And this is so intriguing because Atlaros and Pandrosos were independent cult recipients. And this is not my interpretation, this is a fact, because these two cult recipients had their sanctuaries in different places and were responsible for different things. So that both of them were in a way kurotrophoi. And it's so ironical, that the name of these independent cult recipients were in the 5th century, and I think it's also, this cluster in the late 6th century, that the names of these two existing cult recipients who were active, and Aklaros was important for the Ephebes, that their names were given to 3 girls who were the opposite of kurotrophoi. They never saw the newborn baby, and if they saw it, and those of them who saw it, jumped and committed suicide. So this is one of these strange contradictions. And I wrote a lot about that in my book on this thing. I also think that this change occurred, at the time when when the focus on Erechtheus became on the king of Athens, the defender, and this somewhat curious story about the births was as the Kolonos was then split off. But it's a very intriguing. The Kekropida are a very intriguing bunch.
Thank you, Marion, for the shout out to Hephaistos. It's good to see you. So I have a question about Hephaistos. Is there a link, you think, in the end of the 6th century, we suddenly see Guy Hedry, as you pointed out, all the returns of Hephaistos, right? Hephaistos being brought back by Dionysus. This is popping up a lot in symbolic way. Is there a link here also with the cult of Dionysus, perhaps, and how that is also coming into perspective in this period?
Actually, I would not know, or I would not be able, to say too much about the changes in iconography of Dionysus. I mean, the return of Hephaistos has been a popular subject in Athens, in Athenian images, ever since the second quarter of the 6th century. So I think that the popularity of myth, although where Hephaistos played a role, is kind of a follow-up, of the introduction of the cult. But these bases per se, or the decision to show these myths, do not prove the existence of a cult. That's my point. So you can say, oh, this tests the popularity of the god and everything. And I do, of course, the iconography also of the introduction of Hephaistos would change as the representation of the gods changed from the archaic times to classical times, and you have them make them more younger, rejuvenated. I had problems with the word. You have the gods rejuvenated, and you have another focus on the gods. But this is not specific to one particular persona. This is in the trend of a different view and a different way of telling narratives. In archaic times, you would have the entire story within one image, whereas in classical times you would focus on one particular instant of the narrative. And this has to do with this recurrent changes of iconography and not with the personality of the gods.
Let's say that Jeremy, and maybe there will be a final question.
Oh, are we that late?
Thank you, Marion. That was fantastic and very convincing. There's one aspect of Hephaistos and the birth myth that I want to get you tease out a little further, and that is that the original action whereby Hephaistos fathers the child is an act of pollution, and it's something that clearly disgusts Athena. Sorry, should I be holding this?
Yeah, it's from the column.
Okay. It's something that disgusts Athena, and there's also a comic element in the whole story. Is mentioning the return of Hephaistos to Olympus, and every instance shows him on a donkey with a massively erect phallus.
Yeah, but this is very early in this whole detail. I mean, so yeah.
So there seems to be all sorts of extra layers of complexity about having Hephaistos simply injected into an existing birth narrative, and the idea that by introducing a male figure, we're sort of marginalising what had been a kind of virgin birth is actually a little bit more complicated, because the father figure is himself extraordinarily compromised. Sorry.
Well, you wrote about this, exactly about this issue, and you can be sure that I integrated in the written version of the paper. I did not put much stress on this pollution thing, because I think just the fact that this is appropriation that is very abnormal, that this is almost enough, to stress that is so constructed. It's so abstract. It's so, and of course, you're right. This the semen brings an additional, disgusting element. Yeah? I agree with that. You know, I agree with that. So it's kind of one of these fascinating compromises that we encounter in Greek thought. You know, that persons are joined, that we think, oh, they don't have anything to do, they actually would be antagonists, but on the contrary, you know, they are connected, and I think it's so ingenious how Athena in all these myths always, you know, her role is actually elevated. You know, whenever there are more figures introduced, you know, her role gets even, you know, more elevated in a way, which of course makes perfect sense, you know, from the Athenian perspective.
I see one more question over there. My mic gives up. And definitely really the final question, so it is really sorry.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
So I was fascinated, I just love this whole lecture. I was fascinated by the sort of split between Erechtheus and Erechtheus. Why does that happen, and what's that all about? I mean, it seems such an unnecessary complication, it's never really resolved, and it just sort of hangs there.
Well, it has, of course, puzzled a lot of people, especially because Erechtheus is never, it's never finally separated, you know, and my reconstruction moves a lot on the studies by Untitled, but because, you know, there are these mentions of Erechtheus being the earthborn son, she hesitated, you know, to be so radical and say there was really a new version of the myth. And I'm convinced that there was, and why this was so, I don't know, because it can definitely not have been motivated by the wish to make the Athenian list longer, the list of the Athenian kings, because you made this first in the late 5th century and second by doubling names. There were two Hecropes and that. This cannot have been the reason. The reason must have been that, as I was trying to say, when Erechtheus became one of the eponymous kings, the eponymous heroes, the focus on him was different, maybe because, you know, then of course the earthborn, the idea of the earthborn was a little bit too strange or primordial. And what's really interesting is that this story that I think really evolved at the end of the 6th century, that this of course was a terrific springboard for the idea of autochthony that came up in the mid-5th century. Then you could use this Erechtheus, who was not a cult recipient, who was a cult practitioner, and he became the proto-Athenian. And, you know, that's where Kolonos sets in. And so everybody, you know, could be regarded not physically as a child, you know, of the earth, but relate to this Erechtheus. So it was very practical to have this figure, but I do not think that this was the reason why he was invented. It happened before the autochthony idea really became prevalent in the competition with the Spartans. So this is another big topic, of course, and, you know, it would be another panel.
Well, I'm very glad that we will have the opportunity to discuss your contribution further in our own panel, but I think for now it is time that we all go into the co-Imbra nights and have fun. So thank you very much for being here, and let's also thank Marion again.